So today we're diving into a story that honestly feels like it's been pulled straight from a political thriller. We're talking about a clash of, well, titans.
We really are.
Yeah.
You have a former U.S. president, Donald Trump, on one side,
Mhm.
and on the other, one of the oldest, most respected news institutions in the world, the BBC.
And the weapon in this clash, a lawsuit. But not just any lawsuit. We're talking about a $10 billion lawsuit.
10 billion. It's a number that's almost hard to get your head around, and that figure isn't arbitrary. Our sources confirm it's broken down very specifically. 5 billion for defamation,
Okay.
and another 5 billion for allegedly violating Florida's Deceptive and Unfair Trade Practices Act. But the claims themselves are just as big as the price tag. We're talking about defamation, sure, but also reckless election interference.
Reckless election interference. That phrase alone just elevates this whole thing. It makes it so much more than a simple legal argument over an editing choice.
It does, and that's why our mission for this deep dive is to look at this whole spectacular fight, but not through the usual political lens.
Right. We want to step back.
Exactly. When you see power being used this aggressively against a media organization, you have to ask a different question. What is this lawsuit really doing? What is its function in the broader media system?
And to do that, we're going to use a specific framework, an intellectual toolkit, if you will.
We're applying the propaganda model, specifically a concept from it called Flak, to really unpack what's happening here.
This is the model developed by Herman and Noam Chomsky, and it gives us a kind of blueprint for understanding how these massive, powerful institutions, well, discipline the press.
That's the perfect word for it, discipline.
Yeah.
And it helps us see how powerful forces can maintain control over what you, the listener, get to see and hear and read every day.
So it's like a shortcut to understanding the invisible forces that shape the news.
That's the goal, to make those invisible forces visible.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of this lawsuit then. I mean, for a documentary to trigger a $10 billion response, the mistake, or the alleged mistake, must have been pretty significant. What are the core facts here?
The whole thing centers on a 2024 BBC Panorama documentary. And this documentary was covering the events around the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot.
A very, very sensitive topic.
Extremely. And the lawsuit alleges that the documentary didn't just make a mistake, it grossly and intentionally distorted Trump's speech from earlier that day.
And the specific manipulation they're citing is, I find this part fascinating, because it's all about the power of editing, the power of what you leave out.
That's the absolute heart of it. The claim is that the documentary completely omitted the former president's instruction to his supporters to protest peacefully.
So they just cut that word out.
They cut that instruction out. And what's more, they allegedly spliced together two totally separate comments that were made nearly an hour apart to create a new, more inflammatory sentence.
Wow. Okay, so that's splicing and omission. That's the core of the defamation claim.
That's it. The argument is that by editing the speech in that specific way, by removing the call for peace, the documentary created a false narrative, a damaging suggestion that he was calling for immediate, unrestrained, or even violent action.
And the suit was filed in Florida federal court, naming the BBC and BBC Studios Productions as the defendants.
Correct.
So let's get back to the money. Why $10 billion? Where does a number like that even come from?
Well, his legal team is very direct about it. They say the suit is about holding the BBC accountable for what they call its leftist political agenda and that reckless election interference.
But that sounds political. How do you justify the number legally?
You justify it by targeting the damage done to Trump's personal brand,
Right.
which they argue in the filing is valued in the tens of billions.
I see. So the logic is if the brand is worth, say, 20 or 30 billion, then 10 billion in damages for harming that brand is proportional.
That is the argument. And that valuation, that's the key that weaponizes this lawsuit.
Right.
It takes it from just defending a reputation and turns it into an astronomical financial threat against the BBC as a corporation.
It's a statement.
It's a huge statement. It says, we are financially powerful enough to inflict existential damage on you if you cross this line.
And based on the fallout at the BBC, they certainly seem to have received that message. This wasn't treated like some run-of-the-mill legal challenge.
Not at all. It was cited internally as, and this is a quote, one of the worst crises in its 103-year history.
103 years. Just think about that for a second. That's 2 world wars, the Cold War, countless scandals and political upheavals, and a single editing decision in one documentary causes this level of, well, organizational panic.
And that panic led to immediate consequences. This is what media discipline looks like in the real world. The crisis led directly to the resignations of some very senior people. We're talking about the BBC News CEO, Deborah Turness, and the BBC Director General, Tim Datey.
The two top jobs.
The very top. When a news organization loses its top leadership over one story, it sends a seismic shockwave through the entire media ecosystem. Every editor, every producer, they all see that.
So did the BBC just, roll over? Did they concede the point?
Not entirely. It's a bit complicated. They did issue an apology for what they called an editorial error of judgment.
An error of judgment? That's very specific language.
Very specific. But the lawsuit argues that the BBC hasn't shown what it calls actual remorse or made any meaningful changes to prevent this from happening again, which is why the legal case is still moving forward. The BBC plans to defend itself against the defamation claims.
So the fight isn't over. But as you said, the institutional lesson has already been taught.
The lesson has been taught. The lawsuit also accuses the BBC of having a long pattern of deceiving its audience in coverage of President Trump, all in service of its own leftist political agenda. So this isn't just about one documentary anymore.
It's about a pattern. It's about demanding ideological conformity across the board.
The stakes are just enormous. When a global media company is staring down the barrel of a potential $10 billion liability, every single person in that organization who covers that political figure, they internalize a new level of caution.
Of course.
And that caution, that's the mechanism of control that we're talking about today. The lawsuit functions less like a simple quest for legal justice and more like this massive external force designed to constrain and shape media policy going forward.
It's the ultimate deterrent. So how do we take this incredibly modern, high-stakes legal fight and fit it into a theoretical model that was developed decades ago?
Well, that colossal financial threat, that's the perfect modern-day illustration of filter number 4 in the propaganda model. It's Flak.
So let's go back to the source material. We're talking about the book Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. This framework is all about understanding how public opinion is managed in, supposedly free countries without overt government censorship.
That's the central thesis, that the mass media functions as a system. And the purpose of that system is to communicate messages and symbols that mobilize support for the special interests that really dominate the state and the private sector.
And they argue it's not some, secret conspiracy with people meeting in a dark room. It's more structural. It's built into the economics of how media works.
Precisely. And the key insight, especially for non-totalitarian states, is that control isn't exerted by some government censor's decree. It's exerted through these internalized constraints, what they call filters.
Filters.
These filters create a powerful and often subconscious process of self-censorship. Reporters, editors, commentators, they know the economic and political realities they work under. And so they naturally adjust their work based on what they know is, quote, fit to print.
And in doing so, they end up excluding any kind of fundamental dissent.
It gets weeded out by the system itself.
Okay, so let's quickly lay out all 5 filters. I know we're focusing on one today, but it's important to see how they all work together.
Absolutely. So filter number 1 is size, ownership, and profit orientation. The big media outlets are massive corporations, they're profit-seeking, and they're deeply integrated with the rest of the corporate world. So their interests tend to align with other powerful private interests.
Makes sense. Filter 2.
Filter 2 is advertising. For most major media, advertising is the primary source of income. So the news product is fundamentally dependent on keeping advertisers happy, which isn't always the same thing as keeping the audience informed.
Right. You don't want to run a tough expose on one of your biggest advertisers.
It creates a conflict of interest right at the heart of the business model. Then filter 3 is sourcing. The media relies heavily on information from powerful official sources, government agencies, major corporations, institutional experts.
Why is that?
Because it's cheap, it's reliable, and it's predictable. It's much easier to send a reporter to a White House press briefing than to fund a months-long investigative piece.
Okay. And then we have our focus for today, filter number 4, Flak. We'll come back to that in detail. And finally, filter number 5 was originally called anti-communism.
Which obviously sounds a bit dated now. The Cold War is over. How has that filter evolved?
The function of the filter is exactly the same, even if the label is changed. It's about mobilizing bias against any system or idea that fundamentally threatens the dominant economic and political order. It's a control ideology.
So what would that be today?
Today, that ideology can shift depending on the target. It could be framed as a defense of free market principles or opposition to populism of the left or the right, or the absolute moral necessity of fighting global terrorism.
I see. So if a news story challenges the basic idea that, say, market dynamics are always good, or suggests that there are alternatives to capitalism, that story would face the same kind of ideological wall that a pro-Soviet story would have faced in 1960.
Exactly. The dominant ideology sets the boundaries of acceptable debate. But let's circle back to filter 4, Flak. The sources define Flak as any kind of negative response to a media statement or program.
And this can take a lot of forms, a whole range. It could be letters, phone calls, political pressure, regulatory threats, or in this case, massive legal action.
So let's just simplify this for everyone listening. Flak is basically the price you pay. It's the financial and political cost of printing something that powerful people don't like. And it's explicitly designed to be a means of disciplining the media.
That is the precise takeaway. And here's the crucial part. The ability to generate powerful, costly, threatening flak is directly proportional to how much power you have.
So a regular citizen can complain, but it doesn't really have the same impact.
A regular citizen can send an angry email. A former president with a brand valued in the billions can generate flak that is exponentially more damaging. It's a whole different ballgame.
Can you walk us through the different kinds of flak? I think the source material mentioned direct and indirect flak.
Yes. Direct flak is the overt stuff. It's when the White House calls a network president and demands a story be pulled. Or when a regulatory body like the FCC suddenly launches an investigation into a documentary, forcing the outlet to spend millions in legal fees just to defend its own work.
So it's a direct threat from a center of power.
Exactly. And then you have indirect flak, which is in some ways more insidious.
How so?
This is when powerful interests don't act directly, but they fund external operations specifically designed to attack the media. They'll finance think tanks or monitoring groups that just churn out reports and studies labeling critical journalism as biased, fake news, or incompetent.
So it creates this whole ecosystem of delegitimization.
It creates a constant external narrative that can be used to discredit any inconvenient reporting. Another form of indirect flak is funding political campaigns for politicians who promise to, rein in the media or curb what they call media deviationism.
So if a media organization publishes something that challenges the elite consensus, they're hit from all sides. They face direct legal and regulatory costs, and at the same time, this indirect reputational damage. It's designed to force them back into line.
Which brings us right back to the BBC and that $10 billion lawsuit. It is the textbook definition of powerful interests using massive legal action as flak to constrain media policy. It's about holding them accountable for their so-called leftist political agenda.
It just immediately raises the stakes for any kind of political coverage for every news outlet.
It changes the entire internal risk calculation. An editor isn't just thinking, will my boss be upset with this story? They're thinking, could this story invite a lawsuit that bankrupts our company?
And that threat, that fear, is way more powerful than any explicit order from the government could ever be. It's self-censorship on a massive scale.
To really understand the power of that threat, though, it helps to look at some historical examples. I mean, how have these organized flak machines, as the book calls them, successfully pressured the media to shape national narratives in the past?
Let's do that, because a $10 billion lawsuit is shocking, but it's part of a longer tradition.
It is. The sources give some really strong examples of these external organizations that exist almost purely to perform this monitoring role. One they mention is Freedom House, which the source describes as having served as a, quote, virtual propaganda arm of the government and international right wing.
So these are organizations that stand ready to launch flak anytime the media steps out of line with what elite projects require.
That's their function. And a classic case study is the media's coverage of the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War.
Okay, can you walk us through that? What happened there?
Sure. So after the 1968 Tet Offensive, Freedom House launched this incredibly intense campaign of criticism against the media. Their argument was that the media's coverage was too negative.
Too negative. They were in a war zone.
Right. But the military was assuring everyone success and victory. And the media on the ground was reporting a much messier, more brutal reality. Freedom House claimed that this negative reporting helped lose the war.
So they were blaming the journalists for the policy's failure?
That's the flak. The implicit demand being made wasn't just report the facts correctly. It was, You need to actively support our national ventures abroad. You need to do it with enthusiasm.
So if the media dares to show pessimism or cover the bloody reality of a conflict, they face this immediate organized attack. They're accused of being unpatriotic. Their credibility is questioned.
You're blamed for the failure instead of being rewarded for accurate, brave reporting.
And if that level of criticism, being accused of losing a war, was enough to make editors in the 60s and 70s more cautious, more enthusiastic, as you said.
Imagine the internal pressure today from a potential $10 billion liability hitting your company's balance sheet.
The principle is the same. It's just the price tag that's changed.
Exactly. The threat of financial ruin today, just like the threat of reputational ruin back then, is an incredibly powerful tool for ensuring conformity. And this disciplinary filter, Flak, it works in a powerful synergy with filter number 3, sourcing.
Right. How does that dependency on powerful sources make media outlets so vulnerable to Flak?
Well, news organizations, especially the big ones, they operate on tight deadlines. They need a constant, predictable, reliable flow of information to fill the airtime or the column inches.
They're a machine that needs to be fed.
A machine that needs to be fed. And this reliance means powerful interests can effectively manage the media environment. They can inundate journalists with information press releases, exclusive briefings, lists of expert talking points.
And they can use that flood of information to set the agenda, or even to, as the source says, chase unwanted stories off the front page.
Precisely. You just drown the critical story in a sea of official-sounding noise.
The power dynamic here is really all about resource allocation, isn't it? I remember a really striking statistic from the source material. It notes that in the U.S., there are roughly 20,000 more public relations agents than there are journalists writing the news.
And that ratio, that single statistic, is a devastating insight into the structure of our media.
Yeah.
It means that the vast, vast majority of the raw material for our daily news is being generated by people whose job is not to inform you.
Their job is to spin, to package reality in a way that benefits their powerful clients, whether that's a government or a corporation.
So think about it from the perspective of an overworked journalist on a daily deadline. They're just trying to get a story out. It's so much easier and safer to rely on this pre-packaged, pre-approved material. It creates this comfortable information current that's very easy to swim in.
And very hard to swim against.
Very hard. So if a story is too critical of a powerful interest, that interest doesn't have to explicitly censor it. They can threaten it with massive economic penalties. That's the Flak. And at the same time, they can drown it out with a flood of friendly alternative narratives from their PR networks.
So Flak creates the boundary, and sourcing fills the space inside that boundary with safe, approved content.
It's a very effective 1-2 punch.
And this system, this guarantee that the overall agenda will align with the elite consensus, it extends way beyond just political reporting. It fundamentally shapes how the media decides who we should care about.
And that right there leads us to what is probably the most morally disturbing analysis within the entire propaganda model. The systematic distinction the media makes between worthy and unworthy victims.
This dichotomy is so important to understand. It shows that human suffering in and of itself is not enough to generate media outrage. The core finding here is that the moral weight given to a victim's pain is calibrated almost purely on whether their story serves some elite political purpose.
Exactly right. Victims of official enemy states, they're designated as worthy. They receive intense, indignant, detailed, and voluminous coverage. But victims of the U.S. or its client states, they are designated unworthy. Their stories get minimal, clinical, cold coverage that's been drained of all moral indignation.
Let's get into the specifics with case study A, Populusco versus the Latin American clergy. Here we're comparing the media coverage of a single Polish priest who was murdered by the police in an enemy state, Poland, with the murders of over 100 religious figures in U.S. client states.
The disparity is just staggering. The 1984 murder of Father Jerzy Populusco in Poland generated this immediate, massive, and deeply emotional media firestorm in the United States. He was a worthy victim.
And the numbers.
Populusco, a single individual, received more news coverage than the aggregate of 100 religious victims who were killed in U.S. client states in Central America during a similar period. And that includes 8 victims who were U.S. citizens themselves.
Just to be clear, that 100 includes the 1980 murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero while he was giving Mass, and the horrific murders of the 4 American churchwomen, 3 nuns, and a lay worker, who were raped and killed by the Salvadoran National Guard.
Yes, and the coverage for those 4 American women was less than a tenth of what Populusco received. But it's not just about the quantity of coverage. It's the quality of the reporting that's so profoundly different.
What do you mean by quality?
The coverage of Populisko's death was filled with righteous indignation. The media freely reported all the graphic details from the trial in totalitarian Poland, how his body was badly bruised, how he'd been tied up in a way that he would strangle himself if he struggled. It was visceral, emotional.
So we got the full, gruesome, humanizing detail for the victim of an official enemy. What did the coverage look like for the 4 American women who were murdered by the military of a government we were actively funding and supporting?
Their story was reported antiseptically. The coverage was clinical and cold. The press completely avoided any serious, sustained investigation into who was responsible at the top of the Salvadoran military or government. And subsequent investigations, which the U.S. government itself actively stonewalled to protect its client regime, were either ignored or suppressed by the mass media. They just followed the official U.S. line.
So the key insight here is that moral outrage is not a natural human response to suffering. It's a politically allocated resource. It's switched on or off, depending purely on whether the victim's story benefits the U.S. foreign policy agenda.
It creates this moral vacuum where the identity of the perpetrator, not the severity of the crime, is what determines our collective outrage. And we see this play out even with the most loaded word in our political vocabulary. Which brings us to case study B, the politicized use of genocide.
Genocide. I mean, that word carries immense moral and political weight. You don't use it lightly. So how selectively did the media apply this term in the 1990s?
Extremely selectively. The source material points to a search of a Nexus database of mainstream media outlets. And the findings are stark. When Serbs in Kosovo were designated the enemy, the term genocide was used 220 times in a specific period. Victims of official enemies draw intense focus and the most powerful language imaginable.
220 times. And what about when the perpetrators were U.S. allies?
For U.S. allies like Turkey, in its conflict with the Kurds, the term was used only 14 times. For Indonesia's actions in East Timor, it was used 33 times. The volume of coverage and the language used were deliberately minimized because the perpetrators were our friends.
And the crucial point here is that the actual number of people killed doesn't justify that massive difference in attention, does it?
Not even close. The source material notes that the abuse of Kosovo Albanians, while absolutely serious, involved deaths estimated in the low thousands in the year before the NATO bombing. Now contrast that with our allies. The Turkish war on the Kurds involved an estimated 30,000 or more deaths during that same decade. And in East Timor, the Indonesian military slaughtered between 5,000 and 6,000 civilians in 1999 alone, using U.S. weapons and with U.S. support.
So let me get this straight. The media applied the term genocide nearly 20 times more often to a conflict with a lower death toll, simply because the target, the Serbs, aligned with U.S. political objectives.
It shows that the system prioritizes political utility over actual human suffering. The protection mechanism for allies is incredibly robust. Yeah. The media gave minimal attention to Turkey's abuse of the Kurds precisely because Turkey was a crucial U.S. ally and a major recipient of U.S. aid.
Because intense coverage would have challenged U.S. policy. It would have been inconvenient.
Deeply inconvenient. It's the same reason the horrific civilian deaths resulting from sanctions against Iraq, which some credible reports estimated to be over 1 million lives lost, were almost never covered with any kind of indignation. Those deaths were a direct consequence of U.S. policy, so the victims were unworthy.
This double standard even extends to how the perpetrators themselves are described, which brings us to case study C, the Suharto-Pol Pot dichotomy. We're talking about the specific language used to describe 2 mass murderers.
Pol Pot, the enemy leader of Cambodia, was consistently and unambiguously labeled in 1998 editorials. The words used were crazed, killer, mass murderer, and, quote, the man who slaughtered 2 million. The responsibility was direct, personal, and clear.
Unambiguous evil. But Suharto, the Indonesian dictator and a key U.S. ally for decades, he benefited from a completely different set of terms.
A complete terminological double standard. The media almost never used words like killer or mass murderer for Suharto. And when they had to describe the 1965 massacres where up to 500,000 people were killed, they consistently used the passive voice.
The passive voice, how does that work?
It obscures responsibility. So instead of saying Suharto's army massacred 500,000 people, they would report that a 1965 coup led to the massacres, or that more than 500,000 Indonesians are estimated to have died in a purge of leftists.
So the agent doing the killing is just removed from the sentence. It's replaced by a neutral, depoliticized event like a purge or a coup. Responsibility becomes ambiguous, which makes the U.S. policy of supporting Suharto much more palatable to the American public.
And it gets worse. Suharto also benefited from what the source calls a contextualized apologetic. It's like giving a mass murderer a positive performance review. The media would regularly mention his political repression and violence, but then immediately juxtapose it with claims of bringing stability and economic growth to Indonesia.
Wait a second. So they would acknowledge the mass murder, but then immediately balance it by saying, but hey, look at the stable investment climate he created. That's a huge privilege, that mitigating context.
A privilege that was never, ever afforded to official enemies like Pol Pot or Fidel Castro. You would never see an article saying, sure, Castro was a dictator, but look at Cuba's literacy rates. For enemies, the evil is absolute. For allies, it's complicated and contextualized.
The media even internalized and legitimized Indonesia's illegal invasion and occupation of East Timor.
They did, by repeatedly referring to it as a disputed province and the East Timorese resistance as separatists. By using this official U.S.-friendly terminology, they protected a loyal client state, even as it was committing atrocities on a vast scale.
It all goes back to the U.S. government's position. Because the 1965 massacres were greeted with enthusiasm by U.S. officials at the time as a gleam of light in Asia, the media just followed that lead.
And by systematically downplaying Suharto's crimes, they ensure that the news coverage aligns perfectly with the governing elite's consensus. The whole point of this worthy versus unworthy dichotomy is to show that the level of media attention, the indignation, the context, it is not determined by the moral severity of the crime. It is determined solely by the political utility of the victim's story.
And that consistency is what's so terrifying about it. It means the bias is structural, it's predictable, the quality and quantity of coverage, the placement in the newspaper, the tone, the level of detail, it's all based on the identity of the perpetrator, not the victim.
We see this principle taken to its logical conclusion in cases where the U.S. itself bears direct responsibility for systemic violence. Take the Guatemalan counterinsurgency state in the late 70s and early 80s. The U.S. media gave almost no attention to the systematic murder of up to 100,000 civilians during that period.
100,000 people. And the reason is because these victims, whose suffering was a direct result of U.S.-backed policies and U.S.-trained death squads, were fundamentally unworthy.
They were unworthy because to report on their plight, honestly, would be to expose U.S. responsibility. A responsibility that dated all the way back to the CIA-backed coup that overthrew the democratic government of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954.
And reporting on that history would directly contradict the benevolent self-image that the propaganda framework requires the media to uphold.
It seems that even when inconvenient facts do manage to get reported, they're always framed within a set of assumptions that fundamentally protects the state's positive self-perception.
And that is the ultimate propaganda service, isn't it? And it often happens through, as you said, an unthinking acceptance rather than some malicious conspiracy. It comes from an ingrained belief that Herman and Chomsky called the patriot premise.
The patriot premise, the idea that those in power, the American government, the American military, are inherently operating from lofty intentions and wishful idealism, even when things go horribly, horribly wrong.
So even if the execution is a catastrophe, the motive is assumed to be pure.
The Vietnam War is the textbook example of this in action. Even the harshest mainstream media critics of the war rarely, if ever, challenged the foundational assumption that the U.S. intervention was morally justifiable in the first place. The ultimate frame was always that the U.S. was defending South Vietnam against aggression from others.
Whether that aggression was seen as external from North Vietnam or internal from the National Liberation Front, the U.S. was always the defender, never the aggressor.
Even amidst these horrifying reports of massive chemical warfare, napalm, and staggering civilian casualties, the mainstream media mostly underplayed the sheer savagery of it all. They consistently failed to point out the crucial contradiction.
Which was?
That the U.S. was using these barbaric weapons most heavily in the South, the very population it claimed to be protecting.
The premise that the U.S. mission was noble was simply sacrosanct. And that framework just marginalizes any kind of fundamental dissent. The idea that the U.S. was, in fact, engaged in an act of aggression against Vietnam was simply an unthinkable thought within the mass media's patriotic consensus.
It couldn't be processed.
So the entire system, from the concentrated ownership and the economic constraints of advertising, all the way to the disciplinary power of Flak and the ideological framing of official agendas, it all works as a kind of closed loop. It ensures that fundamental dissent is just virtually excluded from the conversation.
And that's the real genius of the system, if you want to call it that. The control is so pervasive and so fundamental that alternative ways of choosing news stories become, quote, hardly imaginable. It makes the current framework seem natural, objective, and unbiased.
Even though the data from Populusco to the selective use of the word genocide shows this systematic, politically driven distortion of reality.
The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to. And now, today, we are watching one of the most powerful political figures in the world employ this very filter mechanism, Flak, on a scale we've never really seen before.
It's incredible. If Freedom House's criticism of the TET coverage was enough to force editors in the past to be more enthusiastic about a war.
Imagine the internal panic, the chilling effect, created by a $10 billion lawsuit landing on the balance sheet of the BBC. It is the most modern, most powerful iteration of institutional discipline imaginable.
So he started this deep dive anchored in this just mind-boggling scale of the $10 billion lawsuit against the BBC, which all stemmed from an alleged editorial distortion of a speech.
And what we found using this framework is that this legal action operates as a perfect textbook example of Flak. It's a massive, financially crippling signal used by a powerful interest to discipline a media institution for daring to deviate from an elite acceptable political narrative.
And that threat, whether it succeeds in court or not, immediately forces self-censorship. It constrains future editorial policy, not just at the BBC, but across the entire media industry.
We've seen how this pressure system has worked throughout history, from organized flak machines that attack the media as unpatriotic, to these profound systemic mechanisms that categorize victims of U.S. allies as unworthy, denying them the moral concern that is so intensely reserved for victims of official enemies.
The beauty of this system, from the perspective of power, is that media organizations can publish inconvenient facts. They can allow some criticism, which makes the system seem free and open.
But only within certain bounds. It's a limited form of dissent that doesn't fundamentally interfere with the domination of the official agenda. It allows the system to appear non-monolithic while still maintaining this rigid structural control over the basic framework of the narrative.
So what does all of this mean for you, the person listening to this, as you try to make sense of the news you consume every day?
Well, the propaganda model suggests that the media has deeply internalized this patriot premise, the idea that the powerful are inherently benevolent. If a media organization as large and established as the BBC can be subjected to a $10 billion lawsuit for alleged bias, a lawsuit that forces its CEO and Director General to resign,
then you have to consider the far more pervasive pressures, the unspoken ones, the unfiled lawsuits, the ones that are just as effective but happen every single day behind closed doors.
That's the powerful thought to leave you with. That $10 billion suit is the visible, observable cost of deviance. But what vital facts, what crucial stories might you be missing, simply because reporting them would invite too much flack?
Stories that ensure that editors everywhere choose to remain silently within the defined safe boundaries. What stories are being told clinically and coldly, without any moral outrage, simply because the perpetrator is an ally and the victims are unworthy?
So when you consume your daily news, always ask yourself, who benefits from this story being told this way? Who benefits from the stories that are not being told at all? And who ultimately has the financial and political capacity to generate flack? It's the invisible influence of those 5 filters all working together that truly defines the limits of acceptable thought in our mainstream discourse.
Keep those filters in mind. That was the deep dive.